The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Not too long ago, Americans primarily got news from newspapers and network news programs. But with the rise of cable stations and the internet, these traditional outlets are fighting for attention. Today we discuss the current state of journalism with Ray Suarez, senior correspondent for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and author of The Holy Vote, The Politics of Faith in America. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Ray Suarez, welcome to the University of Maryland and to Policy Watch.
Pleasure to be here.
You are what's called a senior correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. What's that mean?
Well, it means that I'm one of the small core of on-air correspondents that present segments every night on the program and can anchor the program in the absence of Jim Lehrer.
Now you say present. Do you have a role in choosing the kinds of programs that are on, or the topics that are on?
It's a collaborative effort. We have a morning editorial meeting where we choose the rundown for that night, assign the different topics to the correspondents, and we get set loose on the world after that. Well, we meet again later in the day to see if everything is falling into place as expected, and then the show goes out at 6 o'clock on Maryland Public Television, 7 o'clock on a lot of stations in the Eastern time zone, and then rolls out across the country.
I've noticed in the day of the internet that the lead stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post, which I can see first thing in the morning, both papers tend to be the same. Plop, plop, plop. But those stories have had a chance to gestate overnight. You at the NewsHour in a slightly different situation, aren't you?
Well, we have a format where there are, in effect, two leads, because we summarize the day's news in 7 or 8 minutes at the top of the hour. Then we begin the longer format part of the program, so you choose a lead for that too. We come out of that news summary and say, now here's what we're going to look at in depth, and we tell the audience, here's what we think is important. And so we have a lead to the news summary and then a lead to the rest of the broadcast.
Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you what's happening to modern journalism, but I was struck by what you just said. You decide what's going to be important. That's a big word. We used to say that's a $50 word. What does the word important mean in this context?
What a person who wants to think of themselves as informed, aware of what's going on around them, should have on board as they go ahead in their life.
So I've read someplace else you said that you're trying to arm people for the work of being a good citizen.
I think that's a fair definition. You know, a lot of the commercial end of the business looks at the audience as a collection of economic actors only, and basically is arming them for the work of being a consumer. And while that is an important portion of your life, I think at the NewsHour we come into this with the view that arming you for the work of being a citizen is important as well, and we'll let the other guys worry about which cologne you buy.
But there is this question, I won't ask you, but there is this question about ratings and long-term support and so forth, right? And you have to reach to some audience so that people want to support the program.
We do pretty well, actually. I don't think people realize that if you take the evening audiences of Fox, CNN, and MSNBC and add them together, they still won't reach the size of the evening audience of the NewsHour.
Wow, what do you know about what the size of the audience
is? It's 3.5, 4 million a night, which makes us smaller by some millions when compared to the commercial evening news, but larger by exponentially larger than the 24-hour cable news network.
Well, some of those networks, I think, that cable news networks have viewerships in the 100,000.
Right.
So that really is a difference. Of course, the other side of this, I read this in the New York Times. It called PBS the Goose Liver Pate Network.
That's so unfair. It really is unfair.
My last unfair
that's
question
lazy. To write that is just lazy, because I, throughout the year, visit public broadcasting stations across the country. And if I told the people in western Michigan, in Kalamazoo, in Ames, Iowa, that they were watching a Goose Liver Pate Network, I think they'd have a pretty good laugh about that, because they don't think of themselves as Goose Liver Pate people.
What are the demographics? Do you know of the show?
We have a fairly high-income audience when compared to other news programs. Our audience tends to read newspapers and magazines more than the audiences of other news programs. Tends to be older. Tends to vote at higher levels. And at a higher level than other programs, hold positions of responsibility in communities and in businesses.
Let me go back to how you started in this business.
Okay.
Are you like one of these people, an immediate success? You started out and right away you were at the top of the top of your business.
I wish. Yeah.
So how did it start?
It would have cut out a lot of the middle stuff. I started really seriously thinking about being in the news business when I was a teenager in Brooklyn, and I guess even earlier, when I would look over my father's sack of foreign coins, because he was in the Navy, and he was in the Navy when I was born, and I moved around to a couple of naval bases when I was a little kid, and I looked at these coins and I thought he was very lucky to have been to all these places around the world. And when I started to think about how I might get to those places, you know, how does a working class kid in Brooklyn think of himself as making the kind of money that it takes to go to these places as a tourist? I mean, it just didn't seem plausible. And growing up during the worst of the Vietnam War, enlisting so to go to other places in the world and meet them on very different circumstances didn't seem to be a good fit for me either. I thought seriously about being a priest, and put that aside in high school when I really fell in love with working at my high school newspaper. I chose a college in part based on which one had a good radio station and a good newspaper.
This is NYU?
And I went to New York University, where I worked at both the newspaper and the radio station. And then left college and got entry-level jobs in both print and broadcasting. And that was going a little slow. I thought there's got to be a way to kickstart this a little bit. And I had met some reporters who worked in Britain, and they said, oh, look, there are tons of day jobs in the news business in Britain. There's a casual labor force in journalism. If you come and work, and if you can find a way to get into the country legally, you can work on Fleet Street, no problem. And it sounded implausible, but it worked.
Wow.
It's not possible really to do it legally now, because they've since closed up some of those loopholes. But I had a friendly editor in New York write a letter to the Home Office saying I was his European correspondent. And I was in, and once I was in, because of the sexism of the laws at that time, my wife was automatically in. So she worked fully legally and all that. And I went to work as a freelance on Fleet Street and learned a great deal about my craft and used the same model and worked in Rome.
And when you were in Rome, you had the good fortune, but maybe the bad luck, to be at the Vatican on a pretty important day.
I was just arriving when it became clear that the Pope had been shot. I started my evening going to a rally by Mother Teresa because a plebiscite was coming up. Italian people were going to vote on whether or not abortion should be legalized in Italy. And the weather was bad, and not too many people showed up to the Mother Teresa rally, so I figured if I run across the river, down the Via della Conciliazione, I'll make it to St. Peter's Square in time for the Wednesday audience. And I'm a much younger man then, and arrive just as people are pouring out of the square in tears, and in the far corner you see the Pope's security people jumping into cars and speeding out of St. Peter's Square. And I quickly ascertain what happened. Now, in those days, in the pre-mobile phone, pre-call anywhere on earth, from anywhere on earth days, getting a phone that could actually make an overseas phone call was a challenge. And I ran into the Vatican press office, and the Italian press had commandeered the phones, and there was no way that I was going to get a phone call to the United States out of there. So I slung my stuff around my neck, and on a dead run ran across Rome from one end to the other to the Foreign Press Association, where I knew I could get an overseas line. And in a way, you're reporting the whole journey, because the Italian security apparatus had a plan if something like this happened. They assumed there was an attack against the state. They shut down all the major roads. There were soldiers on the street, helicopters in the air, heavily armed police all over the place. So when I ran into the Foreign Press Club, got a line, and immediately they put me on. I was on with an editor, tell me what happened, and I basically told him everything I saw from the time I ran into St. Peter's Square. And it was a pretty good story. And it just shows that sometimes luck arrives, but luck doesn't get very far without a little bit of skill for it to stand on. So it wasn't a great time for the Pope, but it certainly worked out for me.
Yes, indeed. Someone once said that success is being ready when luck strikes.
Absolutely. It's a good way of putting it.
In today's world, people would pull out their cell phones and take pictures of the whole event, and they'd be uploaded within seconds, and we'd be watching this around the world, somewhat like the awful thing that happened on campus recently.
Well, think about it. In 30 years, a lot of what made a journalist was the access to the apparatus of storytelling. I knew how to work a tape recorder. I knew how to work a TV camera. I knew how to take a telephone apart so I could file a radio story directly through the phone lines. The access to equipment, the access to the stuff of storytelling has become totally democratized. So now what makes a journalist is not just having a press card in your pocket and someone allowing you to use the tools. Everybody has the tools. So what makes me different from a civilian is now a much more open question. Everybody's a journalist.
So what does make you different?
Well, not everybody's a good journalist, as it turns out. Not everybody knows how to write a story. Not everybody knows what's supposed to be in there and what's not supposed to be in there. Not everybody knows that the fact from graph 32 that might make an interesting close doesn't belong in graph 2, because people say, I don't understand what this means here because I don't know enough about this story yet because you haven't told me. There's actually a lot that a journalist knows how to do to make events that are unreadable, unscannable, undigestible into something that can be understood and taken on board by someone who wasn't there. That's actually a hard thing to do. Because of the ubiquity of technology, we've made an illusion that everybody knows how to do it because everybody knows how to point a camera at something and shoot it. So everyone can play at being a journalist. Not everyone is one.
But that's on the technical side. I'm struck. I was trained as a lawyer. And of course, there's this whole issue of journalistic rights, First Amendment rights, freedom of the press. And many bloggers now claim that they're journalists and they want the same protections as the press. What do you think about all that?
Well, it's interesting to be living through this time of evolution. So far, blogging is not journalism. And as long as it's marked and everybody understands this is journalism, this is blogging, they don't follow the rules that I, as a member of the guild, you know how guilds used to reserve entrance into a profession, they're not observing the laws of the craft. So while it is in many ways something that looks like journalism, it isn't. You can just say whatever you think. I'm sort of bound by rules that say, no, actually you can't say whatever you think. You have to lay foundation, like a lawyer. You have to have attribution, because attribution is part of what makes your story have plausibility, verifiability, which blogging has none of those things.
Everything you say makes sense, except to me, boy, the bloggers are there. They have a large readership, granted not as much as the NewsHour, and they have, at least for now, tremendous influence.
Right, because they've got energy, spontaneity, they've got juice. They've got all the juice. But, you know, journalism, oh, that's so boring, having to check 2 sources. Oh, that's so boring, having to get a quote exactly correct. So you are putting within quotation marks something that somebody actually said instead of something that you think you heard them say. All that stuff, yes, is boring. Just like doing compulsory figures in competitive skating was boring. But it showed certain mastery of the technical craft. So now everybody wants to go out there and do triple jumps, but nobody wants to show that they know how to hold a line. I'm holding a line. It's dull sometimes, but actually it gives people some reassurance that what they're reading actually happened, and that what I say they said, somebody actually said, which is not something that you can take away from reading a blog. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah, I so appreciate what you're saying, but I think actually it's a statistic I gleaned from some of your writings, but a recent poll said that about 1/3 of the people who were asked said they don't believe, quote, anything they see on TV. That's TV. Now, what's the story there? Besides the fact that they're not watching the NewsHour, of course.
Well, TV plots on a very broad continuum, from only lightly connected to reality to something that is very rigorously real. And when you ask people an open-ended question, can you believe anything you see on TV? What pops into their head is the least plausible thing they watch. And they say, nah, TV just doesn't have the ring of truth. I think it's rigged. I don't believe it. I don't believe that reporters don't have an agenda. I don't believe that anchors don't already know the impression they want to create in the audience about a story. Because there are players who do that. You know how during Abu Ghraib, the Department of Defense was under terrible fire, and they went to the public and they said, look, not everybody in a uniform does this. But they understood they had a problem because some of the people in uniform did that. And it besmirched everybody. Well, I'm working in a profession where people decide on their own just how clean they want to be. And it's really up to them. There are very few, it's not like a doctor where there's some sort of board that polices the ethics and polices the actual practice and results. If you're killing people, eventually they catch up with you. I can have corpses buried all over the place and stay ahead of the people who keep the standards for the business for a long time.
What do you think about the FCC used to have the fairness doctrine, and I think actually they abolished it 20 years ago or whatever, although many people think it's still in place. Do you think that would make a difference, especially for cable TV, where you have this sort of vitriolic stuff going on?
Well, I have 2 answers, because I came up and learned how to do this job during the era of the fairness doctrine. And I've worked most of my career in a post-fairness doctrine world. And what removing those restrictions has done has, to quote Chairman Mao, let 100 flowers bloom. You know, you really, if you can talk into a live mic, you can say whatever you want. And as an absolute stone supporter of the First Amendment, I really believe that there's something pretty good about that. The Fairness Doctrine kept us honest back in the old days. It made sure that you did go and get the other side, that you did talk to the other candidate, that you did find out what they had to say and whether they had an answer to this charge from one side as the race was approaching in late October. That was useful.
But that's another problem I have with journalism today, print as well as other media. And that is there's this tendency to have the one side and the other side. And I often feel as if the middle side is missing. What's happening there?
Well, the news culture has changed so that a lot of what passes for news programming now is really just filling up a room with people who are ready to argue with each other. It's cheaper than reporting. It really is. And you need less infrastructure and less staff. So you can turn on MSNBC and really hour after hour it's just people arguing with each other. And it's easier if one of the discussants is here and one of them is way over here, because it just makes it easier. It's more interesting when one is here and one is here. And even more interesting still when in the Venn diagram of their conversation there's a little overlap, where they're willing to concede that the other side actually does have some facts at its disposal.
Where does this take us? Put on your, or take out your crystal ball. 10 years from now, what's national TV like, or is it international now?
It's increasingly international. But I think there'll be, in a portion of the audience, some pushback. So what you'll end up with is not all one thing or all another, but you'll end up with a usable marketplace, so that if you want more sober narrative, more nuanced discussion, there'll be a place for you to get it. If you want people to yell at each other, if you find that entertaining, there'll be some place to get that too. And we will finally be at peace with the notion that not everybody wants to read the New York Times and not everybody wants to watch the O'Reilly Factor. We're well on the way there. The audience is sorting itself out based on market choice. There'll always be newspapers. What's more likely is that they're going to be more expensive and fewer people are going to read them. In effect, we're going to boomerang back to what newspapers were before Joe Pulitzer in the mass market, maybe in the mid-19th century, where people who had certain interests, business, civic, professional, read newspapers as a way of staying in touch with a wider world that they were interested in. And millions of other people could just say, look, I don't need a newspaper. I don't need to read the newspaper. I get everything I want in other places. Now, there are dangers to that. Here we are in the 5th year of the war in Iraq. And I'm not sure it's a majority anymore, but certainly a large plurality of Americans believe Iraq was connected to the September 11th terrorist attacks. That can only happen in a society where a lot of people just aren't paying very close attention.
Well, let's take that theme a little further, because I think it has something to do with what we're talking about. My kids' friends, rarely read the newspapers. If they get any news, it's from the blogs. They seem to have disengaged, and I don't think it's just because of the medium. I think they don't care that much about the news. I think they've become disaffected from the public square.
We used to have a theory in the news that as you got older, you would get more and more interested because you had a life. It's one thing when you're a high school student and a college student and there's not a war on, or the country isn't seized by sudden calamity, to say, look, I'll get to that when I get to it. And you get a job, and maybe you have a 401k, and Maybe you have a fiance at some point. Maybe you have a house. And all those things give you a little bit more purchase on the boring world of grown-ups, where you actually have to watch your chestnuts so they don't get burned up in the fire. And the thinking was that at each new stage in life, there was more engagement, because there had to be. You had to know what was going on in the school system in the city where you live, or the county where you live, because suddenly you had a 4-year-old, and it mattered.
And now?
That's turned out to be wrong.
Yeah.
It's scary. A lot of people just get stuff through the ether, through just casual conversation, through received notion, through jokes on television. A lot of adults who have all those things, all the accoutrements of adult life, still don't read newspapers and still don't watch the news, because they figure, and I've had people tell me this, if there's anything I need to know, I'll find it out. That other stuff, I don't need to know.
Well, on that cheery note, Ray Suarez, thank you for being with us at the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Great pleasure, Doug.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance, and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.